All right, so this was your exam. The first question was right out of the book, and it asked the question, who was the first person to see a cell? And that person was Robert Hooke. So the part of the cell that regulates what enters and leaves the cell is the cell membrane. So when you get your answers back, consider that we discussed this a great deal, and that the cell membrane is the outside of the cell, the very edge of the cell, that allows things to go in and out. It is in fact the definition of the object that compartmentalizes or separates the cell. Outside from inside. The most basic definition of the compartment of a cell. And so the simplest cell, being a bacterium, only has this cell membrane. Another word for cell membrane that we discussed we also discussed the idea of plasma membrane as being an alternative term for the same structure, and is one of the organelles or structures of the cell that you had to know for the test. Again, you had a practice test, you had Quizlets, etc. Not to mention the activities we did in class, the explanations we did in class, the chapter reading, all that. And this is the simplest answer. So when you get your answers back, if you see you got this one wrong, you really have to do some reflection on that. The following are steps that occurred during endocytosis, which is the first step that is out of order. The next question was obviously a mistake by the writers of the question. It seems to me there is no error in the four choices. The order seems to be correct. So that being said, one of your fellow students actually brought this to my attention. A couple people did. I blew off the first attempts as someone to tell me, because I thought, man, there has to be a wrong one, because it's a standardized test. But it turns out there is an error the closer I looked at it. So, good job, you guys, for identifying that as a problem. So, these are all correct. So there is no step that's out of order. Here are some basic steps to how endocytosis happens. It's from the Thought Company, an internet source. And you see what happens is the plasma membrane folds inward. Invaginates is another word, forming a cavity or pocket, as they say here, a pocket that fills with extracellular fluid, molecules, food particles. Foreign matter then gets, like pathogens can also be found in this pocket, or other substances. The plasma membrane folds back onto itself. As you can see, it starts from the pocket, it starts to invaginate, fold even more, and forms a vesicle that pinches off. And then this vesicle, a lysosome can fuse with it and release the hydrolyzing enzymes to destroy the particles. So this was correct. You got credit for this question, post grading by the number of points, the total number of points being reduced, and you keeping the right answers that you got. So if you got this one right, you got bonus points, and if you got it wrong, you got credit for it. So sorry about, there's no way to get it right, so since there is no right answer. So this is a bad question. It is the danger of choosing to pick questions from a database. The advantage here, guys, is that you're getting sample questions from all over, from every source that I can possibly find that for standardized exams. All right, moving on. Which term includes the other three? This one gave a lot of people problems, and it kind of confused me on why it gave you problems. But I guess if you, I just don't, I still, and I've spoken about it with several people, I'm still confused on what's confusing about this. But regardless, I know a lot of people had issues with this question. Which term includes the other three? Well, the nucleus, let's go over it. A nucleus is, what is the nucleus? It's an organelle that contains DNA. And the nucleolus, this is a nucleolus. This does not contain DNA. I apologize. The nucleolus is an organelle that contains RNA. And in fact, a specific kind of RNA that creates called ribosomes. This is where ribosomes are made, in the nucleolus. So ribosomal RNA is where that's where it's all contained. That and all the other components of RNA. All right. What is the nucleus? Well, I hope you know by now the nucleus is organelle that contains DNA and the nucleolus. Again, all this was on your Quizlet and your chapter reading, and you were told clearly that you had to know what each organelle was and what it did. A chloroplast is a plant organelle that conducts photosynthesis. So when we look at these three, organelle, nucleolus, the organelle that holds, contains and assembles the ribosomes, the nucleus that contains DNA, and another organelle called the nucleolus, and chloroplast is a plant organelle. Then I think if you knew those three were organelles, then the only one that would include the other three is, in fact, the word organelle. Notice that organelle is found in each one. All right, moving on. Proteins are assembled at here again is just a simple functional question. Do you know where proteins are formed? That is a ribosome. So far, of the four, except for one bad question, of the four, they were all pretty straightforward, low depth of knowledge questions. These were questions that are just basically, were you paying attention? Did you use the Quizlet cards? Did you read the chapter? Did you put to memory these fairly clearly important fundamental vocabulary words? The process by which molecules of a substance move from an area of higher concentration, area of lower concentration, is known as, now here again, if you've been paying attention, if you've read the chapter, if you've taken notes in class, if you've done the practice activities, the activities in class, then you know the answer to this is diffusion, since that's literally the definition of diffusion. You might ask, what about endocytosis, pinocytosis, and exocytosis? Well, all three of those, this one is moving stuff out of the cell. This is moving water and liquids in large amounts. This is moving particles in. All three of these are active transport. So these three have less to do with concentration. And certainly this is not the definition of those. The exocytosis we just looked at the question number 3. Endocytosis we looked at the example, the definition of in number 3. Pinocytosis and exocytosis. Exocytosis is the opposite of endocytosis, and pinocytosis is very similar to number 3, the endocytosis, except you're dealing with liquids. The force that moves water across the membranes from a more dilute solution into a more concentrated solution in animal cells is called osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure. So let's go through that and see if you didn't know that. Let's assume you didn't know that this is the definition of osmotic pressure. Well, Tuger pressure, have you heard of it? You might have read about it. It's the pressure of water against the cell wall, but I certainly didn't talk about it in class. I didn't test it here because we didn't talk about it in class. So Tuger pressure is not. We will talk about it. We haven't talked about it yet. So there it is. Equilibrium. That's not the definition of equilibrium, although osmotic pressure will get you there, right? The water moving across the membrane from more dilute, from water's high concentration to water's low concentration is the definition of osmosis, and certainly the equilibrium is not that definition. And finally, active transport. Well, it's not active, it's passive. So osmosis is a form of passive transport. We went over it in class. I'll grant you this. If you got number 7 wrong, it's one of those questions where you really didn't have a great deal of practice for it, but I did tell you this was the one thing you need to know. You didn't know what diffusion was and what osmosis was. You didn't have to know all the details, the idea of hypertonic and hypotonic. We weren't going to get into that on this test. We will on the next. But I said you need to know what osmosis is. It's the movement of water when solutes can't move, right? If the solutes can move, then you'll have diffusion moving across the membrane from high to low. But if the solutes can't move, then water has to move. All right. The small membrane bordered structures that contain substances necessary for digestion. You know what? Let me take a moment since I do have some time. Let's think about these membranes that I drew in class. I told you, what if you had these particles on this side, and this membrane was not permeable. Did not allow the particles through. And here you had, let's say, 10% water and 90% solute. And here you had 100% water. Well, here then that this is much more dilute, meaning it's low concentration of particles. That's what dilute means. And we've talked about this since probably the first month in class, the idea of concentrated. This is our first lab. We're still growing the plants from that lab. So this is the most dilute, it's 100% water. This is 10% water, 90% solute. in which direction. What would happen was the question that was asked in class, and many of you answered the solute won't move, but water will in the opposite direction from its high to its low, so it'll move in that direction. But you didn't even have to remember that. All you had to do is remember that water moving, because of its concentration gradient, is known as osmosis. If you knew that, then the pressure created by that is the force that moves the water. The small membrane bordered structures, they contain substances necessary for digestion of some cellular materials, are known as lysosomes. This again is a basic definition. These are exactly what I told you was going to be on the test, which is the definition of all the organelles that were in the Quizlet. 30 slides, 3 weeks, and 1 chapter was what you were asked to accomplish in an honors high school class. Vacuoles are empty vesicles. Mitochondria deal with energy, and we'll get into detail on that. Cellular energy. And nucleoli build. Oh, I shouldn't say build. Nucleoli is the location where ribosomes are assembled. Just the organelles of the cell. The only one that contains the digestive enzymes are the lysosomes. And I think we went over that 3 or 4 times in class as examples. What happens when you die? How is it that the breaking of these cells create cell death? Etc. Sodium ions are transported across the cell membrane by body cells, somatic cells, by one of these. I gave you credit for either one of these. The answer, you may hear my dog panting in the background. We just took her to the vet, so it's unfortunate, but that's what's going on there. So sodium ions are transported across the membranes of body cells, somatic cells, by sodium-potassium pump, the sodium-potassium pump. But because this wasn't strongly covered in the class, if you also put facilitate diffusion, I gave you both answers. I gave you the answer correct. So either one of these would have got you the right answer, or the point. But this one I must mention is it's not facilitate diffusion, so that's not correct. Just for the record. Simple diffusion is not true. Sodium ion can't pass through the membrane because it's charged. And again, passive diffusion, in one way you could have figured out it couldn't have been facilitated diffusion, for the record, is facilitated diffusion is a form of passive diffusion. But there it is. These three are actually the same answer in many ways. The group that simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion are both passive. In any case, neither one of these are correct. So the actual answer is sodium-potassium pump, but you got credit if you put A or B. The organ is made up of, and we will go into why this is the right answer next week on Wednesday, but you should know that this is a form of active transport. And in fact, it was discussed in Chapter 7. But I didn't expect it. I expect you to tell the difference between those two, so I gave you credit for both. I could see why someone might get confused with B, but it's not a correct answer. An organ is made up of tissues. So when you look at the organization of matter in the chapter, it says you have an organism. In fact, we discussed this in class. I have to do this. So organisms, as we discussed, are made of organ systems, which are made of organs, which are made of tissues, which are made of cells, which are made of organelles, which are made of molecules, which are made of atoms. That's the organization of the little different levels of organization. Now you can go even further and start talking about niches and ecosystems and biomes, and then the biosphere, and the bigger organization levels. But as far as this question, an organ is made up of tissues. So the organ is made up of tissues. All right. Tissues are a group of cells, but that is not what an organ is made of. Different systems, organs, a bunch of different organs come up with a system. For instance, as mentioned in class, the cardiovascular system is the heart and the lungs. Your circulatory systems are all your blood vessels. Your nervous system is all the nerves, your brain, your spinal cord, etc. So each system is a group of organs. Only one system is obviously incorrect. So groups of tissue. Not an easy question, but not unreasonable. Most easy if it was. I guess I don't know how to phrase that. It would have to. I don't find it unreasonable at all. Most biological membranes are impermeable, which means nothing allows nothing through. That's not correct. The answer I gave you in class was selectively permeable. And in fact, I remember, if you go back and watch the video, or you can refer to your notes, we talked about the fact that the book uses something called semi-permeable. And someone in class said, well, I understand semi-permeable, but this idea of selectively permeable, this was also used in an activity, which is how the question came up. I believe it was during on the exam, the practice exam that I gave you, selectively permeable. Permeable means allow it to go through. And I said, personally, I prefer selectively permeable versus semi-permeable. I think semi-permeable is misleading, but that's my opinion. So selectively permeable is the answer that I expected. Slightly permeable is not appropriate. Sorry, we're moving, so if you hear any background noise, that's the way it is. Highly permeable is, again, not appropriate. So B is the relatively reasonable answer. A process that requires the addition of energy is active transport. This is another one of those, while you need to have known that, if you got that one wrong, you're not paying attention, you're not taking notes, there's something is going on that stopped you from getting this kind of really big idea that was repeatedly came at you 6 or 7 different ways in activities, in group work, and reading, in classwork, and notes, just in 6 or 7 different ways that active transport requires energy. And in your practice test, so in diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion, as said in a previous question, is passive, so it requires no extra energy. In plant cells, a single large central vacuole structure is filled with, again, this is just, do you know what your organelles are and what they do? Just if you had memorized those, you'd be set with, I think, the majority of these questions. In plant cells, the single large central sac-like structure that is filled with liquid is known as the central vacuole. A plastid is a generalized organelle that does various functions. A chloroplast does photosynthesis. a Golgi apparatus packages proteins. Each one of the organelles has a different function. The animal cells and chemical energy stored in food is changed into compounds that the cell can use by the mitochondria, right? What's the key word here? Chemical energy. As soon as you see chemical energy, you should be thinking mitochondria. So again, the ribosome makes proteins. It doesn't deal with the processing of energy. Smooth endoplasmic reticulum, it modifies proteins and sends the proteins to the Golgi body to be packaged and further modified. Also makes lipids, detoxifies poisons, does a lot of stuff. The smooth ER. The rough ER is where ribosomes are attached to actually produce any of the proteins that are being secreted, leaving the cell, are going to be membrane bound. So these are organelles and how they function. Again, the Quizlet, the book, you were told you had to know what they did. Cells that do not have a nucleus are said to be, wow, this has to be, again, one of those things that was hit over and over and over again, something that should be known. There's two kinds of cells that we talked about, two generalized kinds of cells, the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. All the sources I mentioned before are here again, rear their heads again. Here, the one without a nucleus, keyword, do not have a nucleus, are the prokaryotes. So the answer is, those were the 20 questions. I added 2 questions that were bonus. One was a bonus, and one was really complicated. It was prokaryote. I put a C again, it's a K. All right, so prokaryote. The other words don't make sense for the question. They have nothing to do with the question. Osmotic means the movement of water against down its own concentration gradient, water's concentration from water's high to water's low. Which process transports molecules across the membrane? Which process transports the molecules across the membrane by means of a carrier protein? Covered in class deeply, in the practice questions, in the activities, etc., etc. It'd have to be facilitated diffusion. It's certainly not simple diffusion. That would just mean it's passing through the membrane like oxygen or carbon dioxide from high to low, no problem. Osmosis is the diffusion of water, and phagocytosis is a form of endocytosis, which is where water is solutes are coming in or material is coming in through the enfolding of the membrane, right? So A is the only possible answer there. If two substances of different concentrations are present on either side of a semi-permeable membrane, right, the substances move. This is a kind of a tricky one, because then the question is away from the area of lower concentration toward the two sides. There's a question here that I'm bothered that they asked this question this way. So the question is, do the materials, well, let's not call them materials, do these substances cross the membrane? That's a big question. You know, is it polar? Is it non-polar? Is it small? Is it large? I don't know. But let's go on and read. If the two substances of different concentrations are present on either side of a semi-permeable membrane, the substances move away from the areas of lower concentration toward the area of lower concentration until equilibrium is reached, until all molecular motion ceases. Well, until all molecular motion ceases, we can get rid of right away, because we know that doesn't happen except at absolute zero, and that's not happening in any biological system on planet Earth. Away from the areas of lower concentration, that would mean it's active transport. They're not saying anything about ATP ATP being used, so I can get rid of that one. I have to assume that there is no, that they do pass. I must assume that they pass. I don't like that. So I almost feel like writing a letter to these guys. They should not have had a question where they had you assume. It makes it more stressful than necessary. So we don't know, but we can, since they didn't mention the use of ATP, we can go ahead and assume that they pass, and that we can assume they're going from high to low. So we'd expect that they would go toward an area of lower concentration. We'd expect that would happen. But they would do that. Would they do that until its equilibrium is reached? Well, again, they assume that you'd have to interpret this in the most general way, and it's just very confusing, because you could say until equilibrium is reached, but in equilibrium it's dynamic equilibrium, so it would just keep moving back and forth. They would go from the area of lower concentration until there's no difference in concentration on either side, and then they would continue to keep moving back and forth. That's not really discussed, so the question, I think, is overly generalized. They tried to oversimplify the question, and in turn made it confusing, so it could either be B or C. I decided to go ahead and give you either one of those is correct. And I also gave you some points on the test in general, just, again, as part of the curve, because this question I felt was just unfair. It was just too ambiguous. Which of the following is not part of the cell theory? This is a cell theory. It's, I think, one of the first things that Robert Hooke came up with it. It's discussed in the chapter. It says all things are composed of cells. That's true, and that is part of cell theory. Cells, remember, we're looking for what is not part of the cell theory. So even though that's true, it's true, but it's not the answer. So that's not it. Cells are basic unit of structure and function, are the basic unit of structure and function. So let's leave that one as a question mark. All cells come from other cells. That's true. And B is true, right? And C, the idea that there is a high degree of cell specialization. Well, to some degree that answer is true, but it doesn't answer the question. So that is the answer that we need to put, because the question is which one of these is not part of cell theory. All right. So a tissue is composed of a group of similar cells. Again, an organization level question, and tissues are made of cells. Organs are made of tissues. Cells are made of organelles, and organ systems are made of different organs. The basic units from which cell membranes are constructed are phospholipids. This is a really big idea that you should know. There should be no one getting number 20 wrong. Free moving proteins, no. Protein pumps, no, they do. There are protein pumps. There are free moving proteins. Carbohydrate gates, I don't know of any gate that's just carbohydrates. So A is the right answer there. And after that, but I told you to read it carefully because the answer was simple as long as you knew that isotonic meant the same. So then if we take a look at knowing that the word what the word isotonic means, that they're the same, you were given this table, and there's dialysis table, they gave you a tube, they gave you a diagram, but they asked you in which of these was the dialysis tube isotonic with the beaker. Well, you knew isotonic meant the same, so now all you had to do is read the table. In which is it that the dialysis tube, looking at the title, dialysis tube contents, and the other title of this column says beaker contents, which one of these two is the same? There's only one that's the same, and that's the two distilled waters. So that should have been number 5. All right, number 5, whichever answer letter that is. All right, and that was just testing. Do you understand that isotonic means the same, and can you read a table? The main part, since I gave you the definition of isotonic, this is a question that tested whether you can read a table. If you couldn't read a table, well, then you had problems with this particular question, but we need to get more practice at reading tables if you got this one wrong, okay? Because you really do need to be able to look at a table and identify and gather information. And the last question was, again, it was complicated. We'll go over it in a future class. It was a bonus question. You either got it right or wrong, and you're given points. The whole class got points for it. I'm not even going to concern myself with going over it in this right now. We'll go over it again when we go on for the next test, because you'll see questions about the topic on the next test. All right, so that's all you need to do. Go over these, and you can get up to 22% back, depending on how good an answer, how good a write-up you do. And finally, this one wasn't even on your test. I left these out, so we could go over another exam, but I left those out. And there's